Hey everyone, welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a massive and incredibly detailed policy document that outlines over 40, yes, 40, practical solutions to solve UNRWA's ongoing financial crisis. Now, to be clear right up front, we aren't here to debate the politics today. We're just neutrally unpacking the mechanics of this proposed framework. We really want to look at how this document suggests bridging that enormous gap between high-level diplomatic support and the actual on-the-ground funding needed to keep essential services running for millions of people. So let's get right to it.
The conference ended in disappointment. That's a direct quote right from the source material, and wow, it really hits the nail on the head for setting up today's core problem. See, the document points out this huge structural gap between words and reality. High-level gatherings happen, strong political support is announced, but then the actual financial commitments needed to keep services going just repeatedly fall short. So this quote perfectly hooks us into the real issue here, the friction between what is said and what is actually done.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what we're talking about, the say-do gap. On one hand, you have political solidarity, the diplomatic statements, the warm expressions of support at conferences, but weighing against that on the other side is financial responsibility. That's the concrete, sustainable funding that literally pays the bills. The document argues that this gap is currently putting millions of Palestine refugees at severe risk. To fix this crisis, the scale of financial responsibility absolutely has to balance out the scale of political solidarity.
Okay, let's dive into this. To make sense of all these proposed solutions, we've organized them into a clear agenda for you. First up, the empty promise problem. Second, fixing the funding shortfalls. Third, expanding the donor base. Fourth, transparency tools. And finally, number 5, protecting the humanitarian nexus.
So part 1, the empty promise problem, bridging the say-do gap.
The document frames this funding situation not just as some annoying bureaucratic headache, but as a critical risk to regional stability and human dignity. It argues that unfulfilled pledges create a dangerous ripple effect across the entire region. Just look at this powerful point straight from the text. Solidarity without funding does not protect refugees or sustain services. The authors are really emphasizing the problem here. They're basically saying you cannot run schools or staff medical clinics or pass out food using political speeches. Without turning those statements into tangible financial action, essential operations are, quite literally, paralyzed.
To really ground this bureaucratic issue in human terms, the document spells out exactly what is at stake if donor countries don't disperse their funds quickly. We are talking about immediate, on-the-ground risks to education, basic health care, emergency relief, and fundamental humanitarian assistance. The text explicitly links this abstract concept of delayed funding to the very real threat of cutting off essential lifelines for vulnerable populations.
Moving on to Section 2, fixing the funding shortfalls, structural solutions.
So how do we actually fix it? Well, the document proposes a total structural overhaul of how UNRWA is funded, shifting from a reactive model to a highly proactive one. Let's move through this and see how it builds in 3 clear steps. Step 1 is turning those political statements into immediate emergency commitments to essentially stop the bleeding. But then, Step 2 shifts gear to multi-year agreements. This means getting predictable funding so the agency can actually plan out its services and retain its staff. And finally, Step 3 is creating a dedicated UNRWA stabilization fund. Think of this like a financial safety net, protecting the agency from sudden gaps when regular contributions inevitably get delayed. It's a full transition from emergency band-aids to long-term financial safety nets. Now, a key part of this whole structural overhaul is what the document calls a binding donor pledge mechanism. This is presented as the ultimate fix to that say-do gap we talked about earlier. The whole idea is to move way beyond just voluntary expressions of support and adopt a highly structured mechanism. Meaning, when support is announced at those big, high-level donor conferences, it now comes attached to strict deadlines, follow-up protocols, and guaranteed fulfillment.
The source also suggests some super practical, granular tweaks to current practices. Right now, the system kind of runs on irregular payments and disjointed donations. So the proposed solutions include shifting to predictable monthly or quarterly payment schedules, which would vastly improve cash flow. It also suggests setting up matching fund mechanisms. Basically, major donors would match the contributions of smaller donors, which is a great way to incentivize broader participation.
All right, Section 3, expanding the donor base, beyond traditional avenues.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the document makes a very strong argument that relying solely on a small traditional group of donor nations is just no longer viable for UNRWA's survival. They have to cast a much wider net. The text suggests targeting new government donors across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It also heavily emphasizes engaging Gulf and Arab states much more strategically through coordinated initiatives. But it doesn't stop at governments. It points to private philanthropy, global digital crowdfunding platforms so everyday individuals can chip in, and even mobilizing faith-based organizations to provide ethical and humanitarian support.
To actually attract all these non-traditional donors, the text proposes direct sponsorship programs. So instead of just dumping money into a giant general fund, governments, private companies, or institutions could directly sponsor specific schools, primary healthcare clinics, or even emergency relief baskets. This allows contributors to make their donations highly visible and directly connected to a measurable human impact. It's like being able to see exactly how many kids your specific donation is keeping in a classroom.
That brings us to Section 4, Transparency Tools.
Of course, if you're going to attract and keep all these new donors, you absolutely need strict accountability measures to build trust, right? The proposed mechanisms here are actually quite modern. They include a regularly updated financial transparency dashboard that shows needs, received contributions, and funding gaps. They also propose a public pledge tracking system, which is essentially public accountability to see exactly who promised what and whether they actually delivered. Combine that with regular independent audits and utilizing digital innovation for better cost efficiency, and you've got a really robust framework designed to build deep donor confidence.
But the document also emphasizes that transparency isn't just about cold, hard numbers on a spreadsheet, it's about the narrative. They propose impact-based reporting. This means clearly demonstrating exactly how the funding preserves dignity and protects lives. It's really about telling the story of the treated patient or the educated student. Because, as the text notes, donors are just way more likely to contribute when the human results of their funding are crystal clear.
Moving to our final part, Section 5, Protecting the Humanitarian Nexus.
Here, the source material explores how to categorize and protect specific types of aid from the wild volatility of international political pressure. So, the crucial point is understanding this exact concept, humanitarian development nexus funding. The text argues that UNRWA's work shouldn't just be viewed as emergency charity. Things like education, health, and skills training, they need to be framed as long-term development investments. By shifting this narrative, the work is recognized as a vital pillar of societal development, something that shouldn't be touched by short-term political disputes.
To help facilitate this shift, the document insists on presenting clear funding targets, categorized by sector. So instead of just asking for generic support, they outline very specific needs. For example, education requires funding for schools and digital learning. Health needs medicines and maternal care. Relief requires food, shelter, and a dedicated Gaza emergency reserve. Creating these clear funding targets makes it vastly easier for donors to choose their specific support areas and ensures totally secure supply plans.
Furthermore, the text highlights highly specific, human-centric focus areas that require dedicated protection. This includes funding for refugee youth employment through vocational training, really aimed at reducing despair. There's also dedicated funding for women and girls protection, providing things like dignity kits and safe spaces. And crucially, mental health and psychosocial support to help mitigate trauma and build community resilience among people affected by war and displacement. Beyond just the humanitarian imperative, the document leans heavily into what it calls the regional stability argument. It notes that cutting support doesn't just cause human suffering, it creates instability, frustration, and immense pressure on host communities. It urges host countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria to issue joint appeals, really underlining the reality that funding UNRW is a strategic geopolitical necessity for the entire region, not just a moral obligation.
Which brings us to a really powerful concluding thought directly from the source. Supporting UNRW is not only a humanitarian responsibility, but also a vital contribution to regional stability. The time for statements has passed, the time for decisive action is now. I mean, this brilliantly brings that whole say-do narrative arc right to its climax. Political solidarity is great, it's important, but it is just no longer enough.
And that leaves us with the ultimate question. Will the international community finally translate political solidarity into the concrete, multi-year action needed to preserve human dignity? The solutions are all clearly laid out on the table right here. It's now entirely a matter of implementation. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this focused explainer. I really hope this structured breakdown helped clarify exactly what is being proposed to solve this incredibly complex global challenge. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.